The long and winding road to a resilient and useful crypto regulatory environment. Now, the next moderator is actually one of our favorites. Look, they're all our favorites, but she's definitely one of our favorites because there's very little that she doesn't know about regulation. Professor Donna Redel, formerly Managing Director at the World Economic Forum, but here actually leading the panel. Please welcome Donna Redel.
So the digital assets industry has often complained that the US doesn't have a coordinated, rational approach to regulation. How would you respond to that, not only from your experience, but in general?
So, I think, being a Grayscale for the last 9 years and really having our business rooted in compliant, regulated investment offerings, it's always been our approach to ask for permission, not for forgiveness as an organization. And so what's different about the US as compared to other parts of the world is how fragmented the regulatory environment is. What's been astonishing to us as an industry participant is just how difficult it is for a lot of other industry participants who maybe aren't as large or who don't have such high stakes to get access to regulators, right? To be able to have those frank conversations. And I think for us, we've been at the forefront of helping to educate the SEC, the CFTC, the IRS, the Office of the Control of the Currency, the list goes on and on. We have so many different regulatory bodies engaged in trying to figure out what to do with digital assets. And what's been interesting is for folks like myself who come from the traditional financial services world is that you would think that as this new asset class came along, as it started to gain traction and started to affect more consumers, more businesses, you would think one regulator would raise their hand and say, we're gonna move this into our domain and we're gonna be the ones to oversee this. And instead, where we are, over a decade into digital assets, life, is still a lot of unanswered questions. Who is going to regulate digital assets in the US? What constitutes a crypto security from a crypto commodity? And so, while that paints somewhat of a negative picture, I'm optimistic now that we've turned the corner on the new year. 2023 is going to be a big, big year for regulation for crypto in the US, and we're very excited to engage with industry participants in that regard.
Mark, you are in the EU, and as the prior panel alluded to, there is a new set of regulations, MiCA, that was recently passed and is going to be implemented. How do you think this will impact global standards and crypto adoption?
Thanks, Donna. Yeah, so my name is Mark. Welcome, everybody. I'm the EU policy lead for the Crypto Council for Innovation, based out of Brussels. And we are a global alliance of some of the bigger centralized exchanges and VC funds working on digital assets policy. I think you're right to say that the Europeans have consciously chose to go quicker and faster than other jurisdictions. I think the European Union often feels inferior to the US and Asia Pacific region when it comes to innovation, investment, and some of the opportunities in terms of growing the sector. But it is good at making rules, and it sees it as an opportunity to set a global standard to a certain extent. So they started already a few years back in terms of trying to build the regulatory and legislative regime for digital assets with a clear focus on centralized exchanges and on stable coins. And that took a couple of years, as it always does in Europe. But I think whilst it might not be an ideal piece of legislation, there's always things that some of the actors won't fully agree with. I think they did a pretty good job at making a comprehensive regime and were very open to have a dialogue and engagement with industry. That's offered a certain amount of legal certainty. The legislation isn't finalized yet in terms of being applicable. That's going to happen later this year, this quarter. And then there'll be some important technical work that'll go on in terms of providing some granular detail about how this should be kind of enacted in practice on the ground. But definitely the European Union has done quite a lot, and I think that the idea and intention is that they will use that to provide some inspiration or some ideas for other jurisdictions, but also the work that's going on internationally with the FSB and IOSCO. They're doing quite a lot of work in this space at the moment as well.
Thanks. Lindsey, I see you nodding your head, and I know that your firm works in many jurisdictions. In navigating those jurisdictions, where do you have you seen regulation of digital assets best adopted, and why is regulatory clarity important?
Yeah, I think you can't understate the importance of clarity on the regulatory front. Right now, we see a paralysis of a lot of very well-intended firms and institutions that would like to engage with digital assets, but to Michael's point, again, in the absence of regulatory clarity, are reluctant to do so. So it's very important, in addition to the existing players which want to be compliant, but again, are waiting for the regulatory clarity before they institute the processes and systems to do so. I think the EU, MiCA, is a good step in kind of a more holistic framework, but we do see, if you parse apart, regulation in general is a very broad term, and so there's I would say, more progress has been made on specific areas. So if I take, first of all, like the financial integrity, AML, KYC, the US actually has had a framework in place since 2013 for crypto platforms that has been adopted not only in the US, but has been an inspiration also for OECD providing guidance on that front. When we think about the way that securities and commodities, the rules of regulating the assets themselves, some good things out of Brazil late last year were passed, providing the clarity, again, that most of the digital assets are classified as securities and will be governed as such. And then for the non-securities, there's a new regulatory body to address those. And again, so when the clarity is provided, we're seeing some movement and some calming of the system. Japan provided clarity as well, similarly to the types of digital assets. So security tokens has one regulatory regime. The non-security crypto assets is another one, and then NFTs classified as property. Again, it provides clarity for people to engage and know which regulatory body will also be applying to them. And so I think the securities and the commodities rules are very important. And last but not least, there's been some good work also on tax rules reform. So UK, early last year, looked at a lot of the novel economic situations and transactions coming out of DeFi. And so very pragmatically instituted new tax rules that would apply to these DeFi transactions. So I think the good thing is you have different countries prioritizing different things. And of course, to Mark's point earlier, the other countries watching, seeing what's working, and then adopting them as we go.
So, Michael, I think that recently, post-FTX, there's been a fair amount of criticism of the SEC. But that criticism is not new. From many, including yourselves, with respect to the ETF, and I know that you filed a lawsuit. Even before that, you had your lawyers, I believe it was Davis Polk, write a very in-depth letter about why the SEC is not complying with certain kinds of other laws within the country. How do you think the SEC, in your opinion, has specifically failed the retail customer?
Again, I don't know how much time we have. So I think it's an amalgamation of a couple of things, and some of your commentary really resonates with my answer to Donna's question, which is that when there is regulatory clarity, you mentioned Brazil, you mentioned Japan, it then unlocks all of these other opportunities. But it's not just about unlocking opportunities, it's also unlocking them within regulated frameworks where there are no questions about where the law does and doesn't stop. And really, a lot of the, I think failure on the SEC's part has long been now, and we've, been around crypto through several SEC chairpersons, as well as various commissioners, is that their methodology has centered on regulation by enforcement. Right? And so regulation by enforcement is just literally every day we wake up and the SEC is calling out a bad actor, imposing fines or, some kind of judgment against them. And we're all certainly proponents of doing so, right? Every industry has bad actors, and we certainly want those bad actors to be called out and to be pulled out of the crypto ecosystem. But if you look at those enforcement cases, they then just become landmines across the crypto ecosystem that businesses like mine and others then have to use as guideposts of where to not step into, knowing that the SEC took issue with the way that another actor, another business, another service provider, conducted themselves within the crypto ecosystem. And so, arguably, crypto has gotten so large that it's maybe become beyond the ability for the SEC or certain other U.S. regulators in their current form to regulate. There's been calls for perhaps the creation of an entirely new, federal regulator that could oversee crypto, just because the elements, the attributes that crypto has are just so novel and so unique. And while I am certainly the biggest proponent of saying it's time for regulation beyond enforcement, I have to also say at the same time that everyone attending this conference and the crypto ecosystem as a whole, we're changing constantly, right? Even if you just look at the agenda for the next couple of days here, these are not the topics that we were talking about at the last event or the event before that. And certainly it's not the topics or even certain terms or phrases that were in crypto when I got into crypto 9 years ago. So that does present a challenge for regulators that we all have to bear as a burden, right? And so a lot of our work in DC is certainly focused on education, because we certainly don't want to get to a place where regulators are engaged in the issue, but it's evolving faster than they can keep up with it. The other point I would make, and why I said that 2023 is going to be such a pivotal year for crypto regulation in the US, is we're now finding ourselves in new territory we've never been in before, where there's crypto regulation that has both bipartisan and bicameral support, and that is just was inconceivable a few years ago. And so I am optimistic that we will get some more of that clarity in the year to come, and that will hopefully force the hand of saying, this is going to be certain parts of this will fall under the SEC, the CFTC. It may fall to other regulators as well.
Yeah, just for those of you that are not aware of some of the bills that are in Congress, one of the bills that Michael is probably referring to is the Loomis-Gillibrand bill, which is bipartisan, and it is of particular note that Gillibrand is New York, which has the largest financial system, and so there is something brewing that she is clearly not going to, in one way or another, destroy some relationships with her big base there. Mark, do you have any follow-up comments about ETFs, or because I know in Europe you have quite a few, and then we'll go over to Lindsey.
Yeah, I think I agree with Michael's point about the challenge for regulators and legislators to keep up. I mean, it's always been a problem, perhaps more so in Europe, because our processes are very complex and very long. And the industry is evolving so quickly. But I think that makes it incumbent on us as the industry to have those conversations and dialogues with the policymakers. I think 2023 we'll see whether it's going to be a kind of a crypto congress or not. But there clearly is a lot of interest there. There are a lot of bills. Something may come from that, something may not. But in parallel, the agencies will continue their work. The Treasury is continuing its work. I mentioned earlier the FSB and IOSCO in terms of the international standard setters. So what we want to do as CCI is be the bridge in terms of connecting those two sides, the private sector, the players, the innovators, the builders. And my colleague Sean Lee's here as well. He works with us as an advisor, is following a lot of the stuff that's going on in the APAC region, which is not on the panel, but he'll be with us with the bubble later on if people have questions. There's a huge amount of going on. So I think legislation and regulation is here to stay. It will probably ramp up as the industry becomes more mainstream. And I think to the reference the previous panel where they talked about the interlinkages with traditional finance, I think that is going to make it all the more important that we have this clarity in different jurisdictions. And I think the aim really ideally, like in any sector, is that when you have companies that are operating internationally, and I think the nature of crypto digital is obviously global, the importance of trying to make sure that there is as much consistency and coherence as possible at international level, that will help us grow and evolve the business, providing the products and services that ultimately the consumers and clients want.
Thank you. Lindsey, since the FTX kind of fallout, there's been a number of accounting firms that have publicly stepped away from wanting to do this. This is at the same time in which the industry participants are wanting more real-time accounting, that the consumers are looking to that. How do you see the path forward in this?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the FTX debacle has shown bright light on accounting practices, right? And so if anything, it's underscored the need for much greater transparency and a much higher bar for quality of financial data. And so, how do we work our way out of that? I mean, basically, we have lost trust in the system in terms of the financial data, and as a result, accounting firms, right, are reluctant to walk into that because they can't do their job well. So the way out of it is really, the companies need to get back grounded in solid accounting practices, internal controls, and really adhering to the rules of reporting requirements. So very basic things. And so you have some companies or organizations that were very fast growing that probably didn't invest as properly in that, right? We're focused much more on seizing the growth opportunity. And so I think this has been a big wake-up call for them. There are others that I would say, again, have been at pause because of the lack of clarity on the reporting requirements. And frankly, the accounting for digital assets is extremely complex. It is much more complex than just kind of the traditional financial reporting. The incumbent tools, processes, and systems that organizations or companies will use today are not fit for the complexity, the high volume transactions that we see in digital assets, the high price volatility. So the accounting problem that has surfaced with digital assets is one that has not been well served. So again, we at TaxBit, we're focused on, and our similar players, right, are focused on having accounting tools and solutions that help companies track, calculate, and report on their digital asset activity, right, in a very controlled manner, which then allows the accounting firms to come in and have confidence in their job in verifying for proper financial statements. And so the combination, I think, is not a complicated one, but it does require discipline and adoption of these tools that can help enable that organization of the financial data so that we can get a clear picture really of the health of the business.
And Donna, if I could just add,
Sure.
I don't want to paint for this audience too bleak of a picture, right? Lindsey's highlighting some really important points, and there's a lot more, to come, a lot more progress that can be made. But there are ways to work within the existing financial system, the existing rules and regulations. One of the things that you said that came to mind for us is, working in the U.S. at least with the SEC to have our products become SEC reporting companies, right? To actually be able to file a Form 10, work proactively with the SEC to determine how certain definitions would show up in filings, how certain risk factors would show up in filings, accounting principles, things of that nature. We are making those, important milestones, that important progress, and giving investors as full and fair disclosure as we can within the existing constructs that exist. And then those types of filings can then become the roadmap for other products to come, or, the ways that other companies may be holding digital assets on their balance sheet. And, certainly in the wake of FTX, one of the things you hit on was this idea of trust. I couldn't agree with you more. There is so much mistrust in the system now, and it is incumbent on all of us to figure out how to rebuild trust within the crypto ecosystem, which is not going to be an overnight process. It's also not just within our community, but also in the eyes of regulators as well, to be able to rebuild trust with them and make sure that this remains a priority for them, because crypto as an asset class is certainly not going away. So in our litigating now against the SEC for a Bitcoin ETF in the US, I just can't underscore enough that the Bitcoin community, the broader digital asset community, this is such a pivotal lawsuit. This is not just about converting GBTC to an ETF. This is going to materially influence and shape the way that the regulatory community in the US thinks about and treats digital assets on a go-forward basis. It's up there alongside the Ripple and the SEC case as well, which is also a very pivotal case that is also ongoing. And to your points earlier, there are countless regulators in all jurisdictions around the world that certainly have made excellent progress, but many of them are still waiting and watching to see how US regulators are going to deal with digital assets and what the new frameworks are going to be. We as an industry certainly feel that relying on this construct of, existing rules and regulations that have been around for 80, 100 years are sufficient to govern the way that businesses and individuals interact with digital assets certainly doesn't hold up. So new regulations, new frameworks are coming, and it's really important that as an industry we're galvanizing around these really, really important points of litigation, because they're going to have a material impact on the way that regulators view this.
Please follow up.
Yeah, thanks. No, I fully agree with Michael's saying there, and I think that's the importance of kind of building the building blocks around how we can take some examples of what's being done in certain jurisdictions and then tweak that to the different jurisdictional needs, but making sure there's kind of consistency across the board. So we were working just before the Christmas break on a kind of global regulatory blueprint, if you like, which is alongside our response to the FSB consultation, looking at what the building blocks are from traditional finance, just some of the basic stuff that Lindsey was mentioning, you know, asset segregation, governance, disclosure, reporting, auditing as part of that. That will obviously be different perhaps in each jurisdiction slightly, but the challenges are the same. They're the same across the globe. And the more that we can work together to try and answer those challenges, the better it will be for the industry to be able to have a regime that works more broadly and consistently then. And I think that's where we can, as industry, help the policymakers identify the issues, identify where there's bad practice, which we mentioned earlier, which does need to be rooted out, identify some good practice or how things might need to be tweaked because of the nature of this industry, but drawing on some of the good work which is out there and some of the examples which have worked from traditional finance or elsewhere, in order to be able to ultimately get the trust back. And I think the trust fundamentally will come from the credibility that comes from being regulated entities or at least serious players. And that's what we're doing with all our members. We've been calling for consistent regulation, legislation, kind of a global level. It's very ambitious. It won't happen overnight. But the more we can do towards that, I think we will become more mainstream as an industry. And that's where we will then get the volume. And
Lindsey, please.
And I was going to say, and to your point, of course, the regulators in the different jurisdictions are comparing notes all the time. So there's a lot of active conversations. To your point, there's a lot of looking at the U.S., what they're doing as we sort things out there with some very high-profile cases. And again, similarly to Mark's organization, again, we engage with different regulators across different jurisdictions facing very similar problems. And again, there probably will be local implementations, right, that will vary. But you are seeing some convergence around, I would say, definitions and things. It was also aided by the OECD framework that was recently released.
I just wanted to bring up a couple of few more things. Number one, Michael mentioned education. And just interested in your perspective on the regulators, the legislative people, whether it be in the U.S. or overseas in the EU or the other places. Have they come to understand more about digital assets in these efforts that people have been doing in the last number of years?
Yeah, it is literally hand-to-hand combat. And so, I can think back to, sitting down with the SEC in probably 2015 and, having rooms that were, kind of standing room only, every chair taken, because they were salivating over the opportunity to hear and understand from industry participants as these issues were becoming more and more prevalent. At the time, though, there was not a great level of understanding, right? And we went through various cycles in the crypto market where entirely new constructs came to life. There weren't things like NFTs. There weren't things like stable coins. We weren't seeing the rise of, DeFi platforms, smart contract platforms, the metaverse. All of these things have continued to develop new use cases and new areas of the crypto asset class. What I can say today from our firsthand experience working with regulators as well as legislators is they have come so far, and they've come very far in a short amount of time. They need to ensure, because again, if you zoom out and you're sitting in one of those seats, the crypto market, from a market capitalization standpoint, pales in comparison to a lot of the other markets and asset classes that they're responsible for overseeing. So it's really, again, incumbent on us to remind them just how important an issue this is, be in front of them with new developments, helping to educate, because oftentimes what can happen is that folks are going to these parties with, kind of business moving or kind of self-serving interests. And that's not how these relationships start. That's not how these relationships, should really be formed. It should really start and be rooted in education so that as these frameworks, as these bills are passing across the floor of Congress, they're being viewed through a very informed perspective and not just dismissed for a lack of understanding.
Just building on that, I couldn't agree more. In the last 12 months, or particularly the last 8 months, right, with all of these collapses, the desire for education and information, I would say the savvy and the IQ has increased dramatically. And so we spend a lot of time in our world with the IRS, Treasury, White House, teams that are focused on digital assets, right? They are very hungry and plugging into the industry participants to get educated, and they're asking increasingly sophisticated questions, and I would say have a much better handle on what the issues are. And now, in light of the collapses, right, they sense urgency and an imperative to get to some clarity.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It's true in Europe as well. I mean, I think from an education perspective, what's quite interesting with the Crypto Council, it's unique because we have the kind of trade association side of representing members' interests, but we've also got a kind of a research function, a bit more like a think tank. And I think there's a real appetite, as Lindsey says, from the policymakers to be able to educate themselves and get up to speed and understand. Because whether it's the political actors or the regulators, there is genuinely an interest to try and understand and know what's happening and to make informed decisions about how that can then be regulated. And nobody wants regulation in isolation or in a vacuum or in a bubble. That's a sure route to way of getting bad regulation. I think we were saying earlier that you don't have good regulation or bad regulation, you just have regulation. But part of moving that dial towards it being good is ensuring there's a dialogue. And I think at least in Europe, it's obviously always very complex. You have the European Parliament, you have the Council representing the member states, there's the Commission, then you have all of the regulatory agencies over here as well. But each have their own specific role, and they are very interested. And there's a real open door policy, I feel, in terms of them trying to learn and then being able to make informed decisions about what the policy should look like in that jurisdiction. And again, like I was saying earlier, I think it's different in each jurisdiction, but a lot of the challenges are the same. And no one wants to be either the legislator or the regulator that's put in place a framework which either just totally doesn't work or misses out a big chunk of what's going to happen in the future.
So I'm not always big on people doing prognosis for 2023, but I do think that we could have a little conversation about expectations. It's not lost on us, at least in the United States, and you, of course, because you follow the regulation, that it was just a year ago that the President's Working Group, which was on stablecoins, was basically doing the reporting. It was a little shy of a year that the executive order went out, and in September, all of the volumes and volumes of work came back. Where do you think, given the things that have also happened within the industry, the priority of the regulators and the legislative actions will be? You can follow up, Mark, on what you might also think about in terms of what will happen next in MiCA. But Michael and Lindsey, if you want to, you could talk more globally also, since we do want this to be a global asset.
Yeah, I think the
regulation.
I think the priorities seem to be developing, one around stablecoins and stablecoin regulation. We're obviously seeing that play out in the banking sector at the moment, certainly in the U.S. I think, too, it's some of the questions I posed earlier, which I think we as an industry are starved for the answer for, right? And it's really getting clarity through legislation on where you draw the line between crypto commodities and crypto securities. And that is, of course, going to then influence which regulatory body will be responsible for them. And then I think that dovetails with also regulation of the centralized intermediaries, right? There is today this perpetual call to action for the centralized intermediaries to come into places like the SEC and to register, but it's very difficult for them to even think about doing that because there's no clarity around the assets and the products and services that they offer today. And so I'm optimistic that certainly in the wake of FTX, certainly in the wake of the amount of mistrust in the system, the amount of individuals who have, been harmed by some of this wrongdoing, and the massive amount of leverage that was in the ecosystem, that this will be a further wake-up call to the regulatory community, and what were conversations that were began in 2020 will not be protracted out years and years, but instead will kind of pull forward on the regulatory agenda.
Yeah, and just building off of that, we're also very focused. In 21, the U.S. passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which actually had requirements in there for digital asset brokers. And so we are still waiting the specifics to come out from Treasury, which we expect here probably in the next quarter or two. And that will give clarity on the tax regime in terms of the information we're reporting, exactly who falls under the digital asset broker definition, what are the kind of information do these exchanges need to provide to their consumers so that they can be compliant. And so there's a lot of specificity that we think is forthcoming as well, that we know is a priority because we know that the tax revenue is also significantly underreported from what it could be. So you also have an incentive financially to pay for the IAJ, which was passed already in 21.
And then just to add to that, then the question becomes from a regulatory standpoint, well, where did these types of issues stack up against, rising inflation, a war in Ukraine, all the other issues that, are certainly being, tackled today, and whether or not these crypto issues, become a priority as Congress kind of reconvenes.
Yeah, I think the macroeconomic context is a good one. Obviously, it's very complex and very uncertain, very difficult to predict. And I think we also need to bear in mind that, mentioned in an earlier panel, job cuts, the kind of industry going through a lot of people being harmed. But these are the real people behind this as well. It's people, it's families and things as well. So I think we have to be conscious and mindful of that, and as we rebuild. In terms of the kind of priorities in Europe at the moment, there's quite a few moving parts. There's the main one is looking into MiCA, and so that will be concluded, as I said, later this quarter, hopefully, and that will then give clarity in terms of the high-level framework. There's a lot of technical work that needs to be done there, and the Commission has already asked the European Banking Authority for some guidance around definitions on stable coins, volumes, how you would define that being systemic, and also things around regulatory fees. So a lot of that work is going to go forward and will be really important. So we're having engagement with the regulatory authorities as well in terms of trying to understand what that means and explain how that will impact the industry. There's a huge package around AML in Europe, which is also, one could argue it was already been done in Europe with the transfer of funds regulation, which was the travel rule, but that's also being looked at again in a broader context as Europe overhauls its AML rules, so that's an important one. And to the tax point as well, there's the DAC 8, as we call it, which is the administrative cooperation between member states in terms of tax. That's also being updated in terms of making that more relevant for digital assets in the crypto industry. So there's a huge amount there. I suppose the final point in the kind of longer term, beyond 2023, we have elections in Europe in 2024, new European Parliament, a new Commission. I think what the MiCA framework did quite wisely was they actually said, well, we're going to stop here. We're going to do exchanges, we're going to look at stable coins, but we don't know yet enough about DeFi. We don't know enough about NFTs, how they're developing. And for once, that was actually quite a wise decision, I think. It's impossible to future-proof all legislation, but the Commission said, we want to do these things now. Let's look at how it develops. Let's have some reporting. So there's a mandate in the MiCA regime for the European Commission to start working on looking at quite how NFTs are developing, how DeFi is developing, and what a regulatory regime should look like. And again, I think there's a lot of work that we can do as the industry to constructively input into that process so that when there is future legislation, MiCA 2.0 or whatever we want to call it, the policymakers again can make informed decisions from having the latest information about how industry is developing. And I think that's the bridge role I talked about before in terms of organisations like ourselves and all the people on the panel and in the room trying to really make sure that we can have those conversations and get a good framework.
I do think just a common theme we're going to see in 23 is that the regulations around crypto and digital assets are going to start very familiarly resembling that of traditional financial services, right? And, I think the experiment has proven itself that it can't go unregulated, and so that this increased oversight is forthcoming. And so you will see a lot of parallels, I think, coming into the fold.
Something that we didn't really talk about in prep, but just came to my mind, if you all are willing to take a stab at it, is in the US you have not only the federal, but you have the state regulation. And we have a wide disparity between what's going on perhaps in Wyoming or Texas and New York, the New York State DFS, which some people are holding up as a real model. They've come out with something on stablecoins. People may like or dislike some of the things that they're doing. But where do you think the states come out in some of this regulation as it tries to become more centralized within the federal government?
It's really tough to say. It's a patchwork at the moment, and I think that makes it exceedingly complex for businesses, dealing with money transmitter licenses and having to obtain certain licenses for different jurisdictions around the U.S. I'd say, when we think back to the BIT license and what was passed in New York, that caused a lot of businesses to move out of New York or, not be able to serve New York customers. So I can't say with certainty that is, by any means the model that other states should be following. But I do think we're in a little bit of a wait and see period to see how things shake out more at the federal level before I think states kind of continue to develop these types of regimes.
Lindsey, do you see the same?
Yeah, I do. I mean, again, you see select states really leaning into, others aren't doing anything. I mean, so it's really just, I would say it's very heterogeneous, but in general, looking to the cues for federal to get settled first and then shaping the states around that.
Yeah, I just make a point as well, a kind of analogy in the European context. Obviously, the European Union isn't a federal state, and until MiCA is applicable, the member states are doing their own thing, and there's been a bit of disparity up until then. But the whole idea was to try and have that kind of coherent, consistent regime across the EU, and I think that plays a little bit to the points you guys made in terms of the federal level being able to provide that clarity and consistency at a kind of nation-state level, providing probably more clarity and more opportunities for businesses as they grow.
And in the couple of seconds that we have left, people and some senators or even the SEC chair might say, crypto's the wild, wild west. And how do you reconcile that with the fact that here is an industry that's been asking for a set of cohesive, comprehensive regulation for years now? I'd start with you, Lindsey, Michael, and then Mark, just go down the line.
Yeah, I think that, increasingly over the last 12 months, probably the outcry from industry for that clarity has even become more pronounced. And so I am hoping that the regulators see genuine and sincere intent to be regulated, to have the clarity. They just want to know how it is going to work so that they can conform to that. And I do think, again, the trust is built up over many years. So it's not just paying lip service to it, but it's actually then implementing it, then following it and adhering to it. And so I just think that's going to be a really important part over the coming 2 to 3 years.
Crypto is not the Wild West. Crypto is a nascent asset class that can be scary for a lot of regulators because it evolves quite quickly and has unbelievably large implications. And so I view it as a complete mischaracterization.
Yeah, no, I think the issue is that obviously the press and the media do take a focus on crypto in a very broad sense. We talked earlier about the importance of definitions and being clear in what we're talking about. Things get bandied about in very generalist terms. I think a lot of the focus is around the speculative side of crypto as a financial asset. That does a disservice to the underlying technology, and I think we as an industry also need to do more about really making the case to policymakers of the genuine use cases and the opportunities that the technology can bring in terms of bringing more efficient services, more efficient products to market for consumers.
We will see you all in the bubble at the break, and thank you very much, and we hope that you come with lots of questions.
Thank you.